Well, Stubby was suggested to me by my editor at Anderson Press, Libby Hamilton, and she knew of my lifelong, really, fascination with the idea of peace and conflict and so forth, which stems from my childhood growing up in the Second World War. And the publisher wanted a book to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the peace, of the end of the First World War. And I guess I was one of the obvious people to ask. And it's a story I didn't know, but I have a kind of way back in my head some inkling of this, because when I was growing up in the Second World War, and I should explain that my dad died a month before I was born, and my mother ran the village shop, little village on the east coast of England. And through that village came thousands and thousands of soldiers on their way to the war, and would spend some time in our village training. And at night they would come and play cards in our front room. My mother would still be working in the shop. And so they would take turns, really, to sit on my bedside and tell me stories. Now, we had no books at home, so they couldn't open a book, but they could open the whole world of stories, because they came from many different backgrounds, different cultures. And I found that the more questions I asked them, the longer story time lasted. And I think that's the kind of important thing about reading, an adult reading with a child, is that it shouldn't be the adult reading the story and the child just sort of sucks it up. It should be a joint thing. And that's the kind of, where the real warmth, I think, comes into it, the real thing that's special about sharing a story with a child and encourage them to ask all kinds of questions. And I certainly did that, because I didn't want the story time ever to end. I think real life stories are amazing, but true stories are truly amazing. And there just seems to be, for me, I've always been interested in travel, going to places, and quite often the location in which the story is set is the missing ingredient in the story. So immediately you're dealing with a real place, reality. And so the people who live there, the animals that live there, the kind of geography, the vegetation and so forth, is real, even if the story itself is made up. And I think that comes from being an art student, always having a sketchbook with me, and being encouraged to draw the real world. Not sit in the studio and make stuff up for your imagination. Draw the real world, and then make that, or at least bring out the magic of the real world. Children these days are fully aware of what's going on in the world. Even without thinking about it, they're getting fed all kinds of stuff from the television. They know the sorry state of the world, both in terms of conflict, but also in terms of pollution and threat to the planet, the world they're going to be growing up in. We old folk, we've screwed it up. And it's been one of my, it's a bit pompous to say missions, but it's one of the subjects I've returned to several times in books, is the state of the world, both in terms of conflict and in terms of taking care of the planet. And because they soak this stuff up, I think the more they can engage with it and be encouraged to engage with it, the better, because it is going to be down to them. I think it puts into perspective this knowledge of the futility of it, because at the end of each of those conflicts, the poor soldiers who were suffering meet up. They realise that the other enemy, so-called, are young men just like them. They don't want to be there. They want to be home with their loved ones. And I think that if children can see that, it makes it even more, they can see how pointless it is to have these petty squabbles. If they can see it's all nonsense, and I mean now we've got really cartoon characters running both east and west, and if you can't see what buffoons they are, you know, they've made it simpler really to see what an idiotic idea it is to have these stupid arguments. Of course, it all starts with an idea, and that could be a visual idea. It could be inspired by something you've seen, by some landscape or seascape or whatever, or it could be a subject, a topic, which you want to spend, you know, time working out. And usually, I have in my pocket a notebook, and I'll make notes. Initially, there'd be words, just sort of sketching out a rough framework of what the subject's going to be, but immediately also seeing in my imagination the way I would like to illustrate it. And I tend to plan these books in my notebook initially, because I could be on a train. Long train journeys, plane journeys are fantastic, because I don't have a gadget that I can sort of tune into. I don't take anything to read when I'm traveling. I want to be totally bored, and boredom makes your brain invent work for itself. And so you dredge up these things to occupy your brain, and you just kind of sink into a soup of ideas. And well, I'll do something about that one, and you make a note before you forget it, before it's submerged by another idea. And of course this could happen in the middle of the night, so next to the bed I have a notebook. So kind of a little fragment of dream, put it down before it disappears. Because ideas are everywhere, and you never know when you're going to be hit by one. I was once asked by a child, where do you get ideas from? This was in a school, and I said, what do you have in your pocket? And he fiddled around in his pocket, he came out with some, you know, snotty tissue and whatever, and the stub of a pencil. So as a group we talked about, where did the pencil come from? From the shop, before the shop. And of course it comes from a forest, from a tree. And when that pencil was part of the tree, did it ever dream it would be a pencil? Did it want to be something else? You know? And so you can write a story about anything in your pocket, because everything has a history. It all comes from somewhere, and it's going somewhere else. I think the shared experience is important. Okay, you can send the child, go to bed and look at your gadget and, you know, read off the screen. I think that's really terrible, because going back to my childhood when these random soldiers and sailors would just share their stories, and the stories they told me wouldn't be made up about you know, fairyland or Never Never Land or anything. Often it would be about where they'd come from and about the children they had left behind, the children they were missing, the children who they would like to have been with rather than answering my questions. But I was a kind of surrogate child, and they were my surrogate, you know, big brothers and uncles and whatever. And that shared thing was the important thing. It was the shared thing was more important than the story. The shared experience, that kind of connection, was more important than the story. Yes, there's one in particular. His name is Gus, and he was a Cosby, Kingsdown Scottish borderer. And he became a particular friend of the family and continued writing to us every Christmas. He'd write to many of them wrote to my mother for years and years and years until either they died or she died. And Gus would continue after my mother's death to send me a Christmas card, and we would meet. I'd go to the Edinburgh Book Fair, and he would come from Glasgow to meet me there, or he'd come to Cornwall to stay with us down there, and it was just, you know, fantastic. Oh, I'd be reluctant to advise anybody about how to tell stories to children. I just think it should be not you telling them a story. It should be you engaging them in the story. So it's a two-way thing. And the story, no matter whether it's fantasy or reality, invites the child to be part of it and to ask you questions about it, really. And it goes back to when I was, forever asking questions because I didn't want the story time to ever end. I usually work on 2 or 3 stories at the same time, not knowing in the beginning which one is going to be done first. And so I've always got 3 or 4 stories almost ready to go in rough form with the layouts of the pictures and everything. It's all done, 32-page books, 48-page books, whatever. And one of them will be the one I think I'll go with this, depending on the previous book. It could be a sequel to that, or it could be a complete antidote. And that's why I like working with other writers, because they come up with ideas I would never have thought of. And I might have been doing a couple of humorous books of my own, and then to suddenly get invited to share the experience of working with a grown-up writer doing real books, with chapters and things, is a challenge. And it also requires often a change of style for me. And I've always tried to avoid being known for doing one kind of book, like funny scribbly ones or dark, serious, black and white ones. I like the mixture, which is why I've always liked working on classics, Shakespeare, the Old Testament, Grimm and Anderson and so forth. And because I was lucky for about 20 years of my life, I was doing lots of travelling, commissioned to do travel illustrations around the world, that I have this backlog of sketches of locations from different cultures. So that in turn has meant that I've been asked to illustrate Japanese legends, Chinese legends, Arabian stories, so forth. So that's another kind of different thing, because that kind of invites you to use a slightly different style, different colour palette. Well, it's good because he's unpredictable. You never know what sort of story he's going to come up with. And we met on a school visit, and just by accident, I was leaving the school as he arrived, and we just shook hands in the corridor, and he was late as usual, so he spun up. I said, next time I'm in Cornwall, it was in Cornwall, next time I'm in Cornwall, give me a call. And about 3 months later, he did this. And we went out for dinner with our wives, and at the end of the evening, he gave me a brown envelope with a story in it, a little note. If you like the story, please do illustrate it. And I read it, and I didn't want to illustrate it because it was set in Venice. I had just done a book for Anderson Press set in Venice. And so I said, well, no, but why don't we do a book about, and I thought, well, I'm in Cornwall, he's in Devon, why don't we look about King Arthur, because that's where the Arthurian legends are supposed to have happened. And so we did King Arthur. And we found we liked working together, we liked going to the locations. So then we did Robin Hood. And we were sitting in Sherwood Forest, and he said, this is fun, what should we do next? And we thought that we'd done 2 books about blokes, we should do a girl. So then we did Joan of Arc, and went to France, where the food was much better. And so that's really how it's come about. And while working on one, we discussed what we'd like to do next. And sometimes it's an extension of the one we're doing, or a complete change of pace. And so I've been really lucky that 30-odd books later, he still occasionally asks me to do one.